Hi, ladies.
Hi.
All right, so we'll give a little bit of time while people join the live, and I'll just give a little bit of intro for 1 or 2 minutes so that by the time everybody's signed on, they have you to listen to. I just wanted to let everybody know what the event is about. This is an event that PassBlue decided to put together to bring women's voices from conflict resolution to a wider audience. Mostly, just to put that in more familiar terms, having had the opportunity to talk to Mariam many times and it always being amazing, wanted to bring that opportunity to other people. So that's why we're doing this today. Just a few quick thank yous, co-hosted by PassBlue, which is an independent women-led digital publication founded by Dulcie Lineback and Barbara Crossett, offering in-depth journalism on the US-UN relationship, women's issues, human rights, peacekeeping, and other urgent global matters. The Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, a research institute at Georgetown University dedicated to studying gender and conflict, and we're co-sponsored by UN Women, the UN organization dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. We are here today with Jamille Bigio from the Council on Foreign Relations, and want to also thank the Council on Foreign Relations for their assistance with this. And also want to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York and She's So Social, which is a social media company in New Haven, which has helped us facilitate today, and all of PassBlue's individual subscribers and donors. So just the basic setup, and this is really easy, is you join anytime from now till 3. If you're watching this live, and you can ask questions in the comments. We're going to do a little bit of setup, and it'll be over to audience. If you want to, when you post a question, you can put your name and maybe what you do so we know where you're coming from, or just go ahead and post the question, and any question is fair game. So let me quickly introduce Mariam and Jamille, and then turn it over to them. Mariam Jalabi is the representative of the Syrian National Coalition to the United Nations in New York, and she is also a founding member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement, which was originally a diverse group of 30 politicians and activists. She'll talk a little bit more about what that work looks like and what those two different positions are and why, and what perspective that gives her in her own introduction. So you in the audience can kind of figure out what questions you'd like to ask her. And then our moderator, Jamille Bigio, is currently a senior fellow in the Women in Foreign Policy program at the Council on Foreign Relations. She previously served on the White House National Security Council staff as the Director for Human Rights and Gender. Her research focuses on women's contributions to security and global prosperity. So I'm going to disappear off screen, hand it off to Mariam, who will describe a little where she's coming from in her work, and then Jamille will start with a couple of initial questions and setting the stage a little for where things are at with the Syrian peace process and what kinds of issues we want to look at today. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I always like to start by describing how I came to be in the place that I am at. I used to do business before I became part of this political scene. When the Syrian revolution first started, and I saw my cousins, my friends, people on the street getting dragged and detained and tortured, knowing the history of Syria, being part of a family that has struggled over the decades to create a democratic, peaceful, sustainable culture politically and society-wise, it was very difficult for me to stay away. My family was forced. I have not lived in Syria because my family was forced to flee. My dad was imprisoned many times and he left and he was never able to go back. Many members of my family are the same. So when the Syrian revolution started, I couldn't look anywhere else. That was my passion. That was what I wanted to do. That where I wanted to work. And then attending a lot of the meetings, being part of a lot of the conferences that took place. There were very few women that were being at the forefront or being seen. So myself and a few of my friends and colleagues, we started talking about how we wanted more inclusion for women in all of the talks that are happening in Syria. This is way before. This is in 2011. This is even before any of the militarized space had taken its toll on the conflict. So when the Syrian National Coalition was established, there were a few others before and groups coming together. they actually came to me and said, you talk a lot about inclusion of women, and you're based in New York, and we would like to have more women within the opposition. Will you take this post? And I'm like, yes, I'll do that. But under the condition, at the time I was working with Dr. Najib Ghadbian, and I said I need to work on the inclusion of women in the peace process and all of the talks on Syria. And they're like, yes, please, more power to you if you can do this. And I thought it was an easier job. So I've taken that on, and over the last 6 years, what I have been doing, and it's proven to be very difficult. And I can go a little bit more in why it has been difficult. I don't believe it's just a Syrian issue. It's a global issue why women are not present at the tables, are not part of the political scene. But because of all of that, I became part of a group of women that wanted to do something differently. And we started the Syrian Women Political Movement last year. That's how my both hats come into effect. They're together. We consider the Syrian Women Political Movement the movement that addresses all of the issues that the general opposition is not addressing, of the inclusion of women and women's rights and feminist foreign policy perspective, from a feminist foreign policy perspective.
I think you've put some really important issues on the table that connect to the global trends as we see them, as you noted. Because we see around the world, as conflicts recur, as extremist networks spread, that we need new solutions to advance security. Our current approaches aren't effective. And yet governments, the UN and others, aren't investing enough in proven strategies like the inclusion of women. Women are not only half the population who have their own interests and perspectives, but there's research showing that when women actually participate in peace processes, that it makes them 64% more likely to last. It makes them more effective. And we see on the ground in Syria, for example, that women have helped to negotiate ceasefires to ensure the passage of aid, that they've negotiated the release of detainees, that they've documented human rights violations for future justice, judicial truth and justice efforts, that they have broadened the discussion to include issues that are critical to the long-term future of Syria. And that kind of role is one that we've documented, we've seen in conflict and fragile states around the world, and yet still that's not translated to ensuring that women have a seat at the table and have the opportunity to influence the discussion. Too often we privilege the perspectives of combatants and ignore the perspectives of those who are affected by the conflict the most. We've done research here at the Council on Foreign Relations that's demonstrated that 2% of mediators are women since 1990, 5% of witnesses and signatories are women.
We Syrians are very well ahead of that.
And 9% are negotiators. So in that, exactly, at the beginning stages of the negotiations, Syrian women weren't at the table. But later, I know later rounds, it was up to 15.
We're at 15%.
At 15%, so still, but, and then the question of the extent to which, with those seats, you're able to influence the negotiation. But I mean, turning back to Syria, we see this spring that the conflict has entered its 8th year, with over 400,000 people killed, 11 million displaced from their homes, more than 13 million in need of humanitarian assistance. These are just numbers as I read them, but the breadth of the effect. 400,000 people killed, 11 million displaced. We know that tens of thousands of people have disappeared into government jails where torture and mistreatment are rife, sometimes causing death. We know that the peace talks have faltered, and that in parallel, the Syrian government, with Russian and Iranian support, has steadily regained control of territory. In just a few days, Turkey is going to host the next round of talks with Russia, Germany, and France, and we know that there's going to be a change of guard at the UN with the long-serving UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, to step down at the end of November. So there's a lot happening in the Syrian political space, and in the space kind of thinking about what the future looks like. So in that context, where's the opposition today? where is it, and what is it working for? What are its priorities right now?
When Syrian people came out to the streets resisting a regime that imprisoned, tortured, detained with impunity, had an emergency law in effect, when people came out to the street calling for dignity, justice, freedom, the right to actually live normal life like regular citizens, like other parts of the world, we had zero land and we had zero support from the international community. People still came out because there was a calling that made them, with the whole beginning of the Arab Spring, Syrian people felt that they actually deserved also to be free.
And it's such a critical point that they had zero land, because right now the assessment is that the regime has regained territory and therefore the opposition is defeated.
Yes, yeah. Whereas the opposition today, when the regime and its allies have actually taken back over 60% of the land, at one point where the organization Syrian Opposition Coalition had started, they had 13% of the land. But is that the criteria where we define the right or the human rights with? When Syrians came out, we didn't have any of that, and we don't have. It doesn't matter what we're doing right now, because we're still calling for the same things. We're still asking for the same thing. There was a period where we kind of worked with some of the rebels that were on the ground because of the brutal force that the regime has used against the civilian population. The resistance, the militarized resistance, sprung up, and one of the reasons for that was that there was military groups that had defected from the regime itself. So they came out and they created all of these brigades to resist what was happening on the ground from the brutal force that the regime was using against them. That's how it kind of changed and shifted into the militarized field. And now we're going to a point where that doesn't work anymore, because the support that came at the time for the militarized group on the ground does not have the same kind of support anymore. But the thing is that for us, it is very important that we stay on course with what we started: human rights, dignity, justice, and keep on doing that. Therefore, we exist, we're still out there. Civil society groups are still very actively working on the ground. The international community is also working with the opposition, the Syrian Opposition Coalition. And now, we can go into the details later for people who want to know more, but there is a group of 36 people that has been selected in Riyadh Conference 2 last November that are the main negotiating body, the Syrian Negotiation Commission, that is assigned with the task of going and negotiating in Geneva. Talks have been stalled for the last full year, so whenever that's happening, there is work that's being done in creating constitutional committee. There's a process that's still going on, but that's where we are. We're still at the same place, that we want to be at the forefront of creating democracy, freedom, dignity for all Syrian people, to have rule of law rule the country, not a dictator that is just killing and detaining and executing with impunity.
As talk shift to thinking about reconstruction and what that could look like, as we start to plan for a new constitution and for, at some point having aid come into the country to help it recover and rebuild, what are your thoughts on what needs to shape that? What are the priorities that should be influencing plans around future support for the Syrian state?
Syria is destroyed, and it's destroyed at the hands of the regime and its allies, because nobody else has the kind of air power that the regime and Russia have, or the kind of ground power that the regime and the Iranians have. So I'm not exactly sure about the exact numbers, but about 60 to 70% of the infrastructure in Syria is actually destroyed. Some 80% of electricity that is no longer. And the attack has been actually happening specifically on hospitals and facilities and service centers and schools. So the destruction has affected the Syrian population en masse. There are over 3 million children that are in school age that are not going to school. So when a lot of the talk is happening about reconstruction, and it's talking about bringing in, this is what Russian Iranians are actually trying to push for. Mostly Russia is like the one at the forefront, running the show for the regime. They're talking about that, how they need to reconstruct Syria, and the international community is saying, no, we cannot send any reconstruction money unless there is some kind of a transition. And thankfully, they've been holding on to that until now, even some of the trickles of money here and there that is going to Syria in different forms. But what we say is that how could you give money to a regime, a government that's actually destroyed all of this? You're going to give them money to rebuild and destroy again? Or what is the tactic? What is the policy behind this? So we're still standing by there should be no way that the reconstruction money or early recovery or whatever they want to call it to come to the regime. It has to be done through different means, different time, different way, in order to benefit people most. There is no way that it comes through the regime's areas or anything that's connected to the regime that's actually going to be beneficial to the people at this point.
You talked before about wanting a free Syria with rule of law, and what are the priorities of the Syrian Women's Political Movement, and how do you think we get there from where we are today?
I'm going to interject super quickly from off screen to just say, just talk twice as fast because a couple people have asked for it to just be a little bit louder. So just try to get twice as loud.
Twice
Thank you.
as loud.
Yeah, not twice as fast.
The Syrian Women Political Movement, as I said earlier when I talked, was established for the reason that women have not been included in the processes that have been taking place in Syria, about Syria. And this is not, as far as I'm concerned, this is not a Syrian problem. This is a problem of an international scale. Because when you're looking around the world and you see where women are, it's very difficult to see women beyond the 20% representation, except for the Scandinavian countries. In general, in the majority or the average of women participation in politics or in parliament or in governments are actually at around 18%. So women are not in any place at 30%, which we have been asking for to include in the Syrian context. So what has happened is that being included within the bodies that already exist has proven to be very difficult, because there are a lot of political affiliations, political contacts or political representations that needed to be included in these groups. And living in a world where a lot of the politics is run by the men, a lot of the political ideas, not just in Syria, I need to keep emphasizing that this is not a Syrian phenomenon. Politics are run by men everywhere, mostly men everywhere. So you've got the one and off sometime, a woman here and a woman there, but it's not systematically, we're not systematically included. So over the 6 years, we have tried different ways of how to be included. One of the ways was to become an advisory group to the opposition, which is a tactic we use, like the UN has used when they created the Women Advisory Board to Staffan de Mistura. So, but this has proven to be also further marginalizing women, because now we said, okay, we have women sitting there, but again, they're not sitting at the table. They are only involved as much as the men or the group that's running the show gives them the papers, or ask them questions and lets them intervene in the talks or in the negotiations that are happening. So it became very apparent that we as Syrian women, all of us are working in our individual capacities all around the country and globally, and it felt that we needed to come together in one front, because I keep repeating this, the whole of us together, all of these women, is so much stronger and much more influential and effective than the sum of our parts, working individually, separately. And we decided that we don't have to come in opposition to the opposition that already exists. We're not in competition to the opposition that already exists. We want to be a new driving force. We actually want to lead the upcoming negotiations, the upcoming solutions for Syria from a feminist perspective, which includes all parts of society. And as much as I agree with all of the wonderful things that women bring to the table when they are part of negotiation, which is a more sustained, longer peace, better lasting, better results, that seems to feel like it's about the qualities and the qualifications of women who are actually coming and sitting at the table. Every time we wanted to include women, and this is, I think it's a global issue also, is like, what has she done? What is the experience of this woman? Where is she coming from? What are her qualifications? Meanwhile, that doesn't happen as often with the men being included in all of these settings. So we started the Syrian Women Political Movement to bring all of these individual women who are working separately into one whole, one movement, so that we move together stronger and better, and hold the hand of the opposition that exists already to lead them into the right direction when we feel that they're taking the wrong course, or correct them, or try to oppose, or try, like, we wanted to be in a place where we are talking independently and focusing on issues that that the opposition has not been focusing on, which is like women's rights, human rights on the ground, and the need for establishing a base for democracy and inclusion that included 50% of society. As an example that I use also is that as much as I respect this whole Syrian Negotiation Commission that I represent and work with and talk with, and I have full, appreciation of all of the work they do, and I totally believe in the course that they have taken. They have 7 representatives of the rebel groups within the 36, and they have 3 seats for women. It does happen that we have 6 women on the table because the other 3 women were brought in as part of a political bloc that exists, that has certain seats within this commission or this coalition of opposition forces. They brought in women, so we have 6 women, but the seats that are actually assigned for women are 3. Meanwhile, there are 7 for the rebels. So looking at this kind of a structure, and I understand that it is on the ground now, it is the rebel forces that are, or the military forces that are speaking the loudest, but we want to change that course, where it's actually human rights, it's international law, it's international conventions that are speaking the loudest to bring a solution for Syria.
So to do that, how do you get past the assumptions that there isn't a space for women at the table in government and foreign affairs and military defense conversations?
How do we get beyond their assumption that we shouldn't be included?
Yes,
that we shouldn't be
pushback
included
from them. That
there is a different discourse. Like, we have a lot of discussions and talks about this and about how to make sure women are at the forefront. We were going to get pushback, of course. I'm sitting comfortably at a chair. It's not in human nature so that I stand up out of this chair, and you go on the metros in New York City. I mean, you see it. It could be a pregnant woman standing in the middle, and many times nobody sees her, nobody stands up for her. So when you are in a position where you're sitting comfortably in a seat, there's nobody that's going to stand up and give you their seat. Unless you come and you talk with them and you tell them, hey, maybe we can share the seat. Maybe you can sit at that seat that's a little bit more comfortable, so I can take the leading seat here so you can watch a little bit from the side. There are different tactics that we can use, but it is well-known fact about the world that somebody with privilege, it's very difficult to give up their privileges. So we do not ask. We act as if we have that seat. We behave. We move that we have that seat. And thankfully, in the sphere of politics, there is no actual physical seat. So once we appeared, we launched as Syrian Women Political Movement, we started being recognized. We started getting the space, we started getting the place like this for me to sit and talk, and many other members of the movement that are actually being given the space to talk and express their ideas about what they see as a solution for Syria.
It's a good tip for many of us and many groups around the world, I think. You have incredible networks from here with Syrians on the ground, with others in the diaspora around the world, exchanging information. So what do you think is most missing in the news coverage of Syria today? What should we be paying attention to more?
I think I want to go back to the same subject like I was talking about. It's not about land, and it's not about who has. This is what's in the media. All of the articles that I'm seeing, all of the stuff that's coming out in the news, and in talking about Syria, we're always talking about what the regime has and what the opposition has. who are the allies to the regime and who are the allies to the opposition. And also this has created this dichotomy of it's an opposition and it's a regime, and there are no people, as if people are the bystanders or the victims of this conflict. This is very vastly misrepresented in the mainstream media. It's people who came out on the streets. It's people like me. It's civilians. It's citizens that came out to the street, that started this whole quest for democracy and freedom. And I love what one time Obama said. He said, "Oh, it's farmers and engineers and teachers that are, forming the opposition." Yes, right. Because we are the civilians who wanted our rights to come out and be this opposition. Most of the opposition, actually, the head of the opposition and a lot of the people who are part of the opposition are actually people who left their jobs as doctors, as teachers, as businessmen, as other professionals. Me, doing my profession from before being part of business, I left all of that and I became part of this because we needed to create something that served all Syrians. This is overlooked in the media. It's portrayed as if it's a military power. One of the words that really get to me also in the media when they use it's civil war. What's happening in Syria is not a civil war. It's a war of the government against its people. And this is very clear when you're looking at any statistics, at any kind of numbers that are coming from the ground, where over 90% of the people that are being killed are killed at the hand of the regime and its allies. 90% of the destructions happened at the regime of the allies. Most of the refugees are running from areas that the regime had been bombing and with no impunity arresting, detaining. And we could see this from now the new taken back areas by the regime, how the arrests and the tortures and the terror started again in those neighborhoods, in those areas, in Eastern Ghouta, in Daraa, in Homs, and all of the places the regime has taken back over. So this is not seen they feel, oh, okay, now we're stabilizing Syria. Stabilizing under a dictator is not stable. It means the brewing of democracy, of freedom. People are born free, and they're going to keep asking for their freedom no matter how they get oppressed. It might be in 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 50 years. It's not going to stop.
I mentioned before how we see in negotiations that too often we privilege the voices of the combatants and ignore those who are most affected by conflict. We see that same trend in the media. As you're saying,
exactly.
that what's
press.
missing is more attention to the voices and perspectives of those most affected by the conflict, to the civilians that are living and working and finding incredible solutions to get by day to day in Syria while trying to dream of what comes next.
And I think it's very important also now, just listening to you, is that we need to shift our discourse from a discourse about power to a discourse about human rights and international law. Even within the media and the way the Syrian context or the Syrian crisis has been presented, it's been presented from the prospect of power. Who has more power? Who are the actors who are on the ground? It's a political deal that's happening in the region between the different regional powers and international powers.
Right.
What we need to do is that shift to this discourse where it is a place where human rights are being violated en masse. What do we do to solve this crisis? The only people who paid attention a little bit was the EU or Germany now getting involved, or France, or people who have suffered from I'm calling from the refugees coming, the influx of refugees. And as we all know, Syrian refugees are not running from famine or running from better potential for work or education. They're actually running from bombs falling over their heads. They're actually running for their lives. When a family puts kids on a boat, and in a very dangerous, risky boat, and wants to cross the sea, that gives you an example of that means what they left behind is more dangerous. This is the only time that then the Europeans or the international community started thinking about what's happening in Syria from a different perspective, from a different context. Is okay, we need to solve this crisis, and it's not going to get resolved as long as this regime that's creating all of this havoc on the ground is still in power, is still in place.
Right.
But he still is.
So, you brought up refugees.
Yes.
The numbers are astounding of
Yes.
those both displaced within
yes,
Syria
yes.
and the numbers displaced outside of Syria.
Yes.
And on the table already is the question of, will people go back? So can you talk about what's important to know about Syrian refugees right now?
Very basic. Syrians have left a situation on the ground that was not conducive to their livelihood, that they could not survive. They did not know if they're living the next day. They left that. That has not changed. How are they going to come back to a place where there are no guarantees for them not to be arrested or not to be detained or not to be tortured or not to be killed? One of the very striking statistics that I keep talking about, I keep mentioning, is that a girl, a 17-year-old or a teenage girl in Syria is more likely to be raped, tortured, detained than graduate high school. This is the place that the Syria exists until today. How are you going to convince people to go back? People are not going to go back. This is one of the things that Russia has been talking about, is that we're creating safe spaces, when they did. And big stark example is Ghouta, Eastern Ghouta. They said, they gave guarantees to everybody, if you surrender, because Ghouta was not surrendering, send all of the rebels, their families, everybody to the north, then all of whoever decides to leave, decides to stay, they become part of, carry the regime flag, and you're free and good, and that's not what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the example that the Syrians feel and see while they're outside, so there is no way they can come back.
Mm-hmm.
As long as Syria is in the place that it is in today.
Mm-hmm.
Or as long as the regime is in the place, I think. Yes. As long as this regime is in place, and this regime is not a regime, I want to go back also, this is not a regime that started in 2011. This is a regime that people need to understand. This is a son of a dictator. He's a dictator of a dictator. This regime has existed in Syria since 1971. The father came by coup to Syria, took over by military power, and killed and imprisoned all of the generals or all of the officers that came with him, and took over power in Syria. And then when there was any kind of movement to topple the regime, there was these massacres. One of them was a big massacre in Hama in 82, where the regime went in and killed about 30 to 40, even some estimates say to 50,000 people in few days. All men, the ages 16 and above. This is the kind of regime, this is the kind of Syria we have lived in. Right. It's not something that, Syrians are just unhappy with, with education and unhappy with some of the livelihood they live. This is a very oppressive regime that has been detaining and killing and executing people under the emergency law without any impunity, without any account. Or accountability that's being put on them, which will bring me later on to the accountability question.
Yes, let's come to that. Let me just pause and invite you to pose your questions. We have an incredible source of information here, as you can tell already, so please let us know if you have any questions that you'd like us to pose to Mariam. So one question is, where are the pockets of hope that inclusive peace could be achieved in Syria? What makes you hopeful when you look at what's happening in Syria today?
When Syrian revolution started, there were about 700 civil society groups registered in the country. And they were under the auspices of the government. A lot of them were actually run by the first lady, the ones that had to do with, change and women issues and stuff like that. I'm not very familiar with all of the stuff that she did. But since then, since the revolution started, there has been over 2,500 organizations that have sprung up.
Wow.
And in the region and inside Syria. This has given the momentum for Syrian people to make decisions for themselves, to come up with organizations, with ways of how to handle what's happening, the crisis on the ground. I consider something like the Syrian Women Political Movement, us women coming together, has been also a push from this catastrophe that's happening on the ground, Because yes, we are coming together as women, but we are coming together because we want a solution for our country. We want to find a way of how to protect our citizens, our people, and create a space that is respecting everybody equally under the law, that everybody has equal citizenship. I look at all of this momentum, this inertia that the Syrian people have come through forward with, and when I talk to people in the inside, when I talk to organizations on the ground, I get inspired by their resilience, by the ideas they have, by the work that they are doing on the ground. Because people's nature inside, unless it gets corrupted, like some people were getting corrupted, but mostly it actually strives and becomes so much better, and as when it actually is under respect of human life and human dignity, and respect for children, respect for the elderly, respect for education, respect for healthcare, respect for what makes a better country. I believe that most people want that. I believe that most people, most Syrians, and everybody in the world wants to live a better life. This is what we are all striving for. So I look at examples. This has been happening in Syria, let's say, like for the last 7 years, the war against the people. It's the oppression has been happening for the last 50 years. There are some countries in the world that have lived this, for decades. But then I look at we need to look at the longer history perspective also. Let's look at the European countries. The European countries have spilled so much blood and killed each other so much. I mean, Second World War is not that far off, like 1945. It's just finished, it's like 100 years. Like, it's not less than 100 years. We are going towards a humanitarian, a more inclusive, a more democratic world in general, even if we take some steps back. Mm-hmm. So that's why when we are talking in the Syrian Women Political Movement, we talk about stages that we're working with. We talk about the stage that we're working on immediately right now, the crises, the issues that rise up momentarily right now. And then we talk about the medium range, which is the transition that's going to take place, where we want to be part of, so that we're building a new Syria that accounts for all human rights and all marginalized voices, all women, to be included in the diversity, to maintain the diversity that Syria has. And then there's the long term, the long range, which is decades work. It's my daughter, my daughter's daughter, like it's generations and generations to come, where we need to keep working together to build a better Syria. And I mean, Europeans still have a long way to go when it comes to women issues also, but some things they have found a solution. They have found a way in the European Union, even if some are leaving and coming, but it's the course of history where what's good for all, what's good for one person or one nation is good for all. Mm-hmm. And we all benefit from it. And I believe this will come to fruitations if it's not now, but in decades. That's where I look at the ground, I look at the resilience of the people, and I look at history, and I get my hope and my passion from.
Mm-hmm. We have a few questions coming in. One question, can you please tell us more about the role of youth in the peace process, including of young girls?
When I keep saying the sentence, when the revolution started in 2011, people who came out on the streets, people who ran the demonstrations, people who started the local councils were actually mostly youth. It was the young generation that decided this is something, and we see in the Arab Spring, a lot of the people who came out on the streets also were part of the youth. So they were leading everything that's happening on the ground, whether it's like documentation, planning, nonviolence movement. All of this was for months on end in the hands of the youth. Once the crisis became, or the war against the people became so severe that the regime started using extreme force against the people, and it became militarized, that's when the youth and women's voices and girls' voices got marginalized. Then it became in the hand of the middle-aged men, and then also it became in the hands of the older men who had been running the opposition for decades before, it started becoming more and more a political arena where it's the older generation, it's run by the older generation. Mm-hmm. I like telling a story when I'm talking about the youth. I don't know how much time we have. The first meeting we had of the opposition, it was in Antalya, June 2011. we were at this meeting, and it was about, I think it was over 150 people that were there, maybe more even. And it was very little women participation. And there were quite a bit of youth in general from the men, but also not in the percentages that have participated in the revolution, or that have been detained and and released, or have been leading demonstrations inside, or working with the local coordinating committees on the ground. So we decided that women and the youth should be actually sitting at the front, because when you're looking at the room, you see all of the older generation, all of the men, are sitting at the front in this, because the rows are sit like in the table, like you have like panelists, and then you have all of the seats in the rows. And then one of the things that one of my colleagues said, let's go all sit at the front, bring mostly women, let's sit at the front, and let others sit in the back. So we go and sit at the front seats, like, and I'm reluctant, like, how am I going to take somebody's seat? I have so much respect for these people. And when somebody comes and talks to me, like, I'm going to jump up and give him his seat back. So they do come, and somebody asks me, it's like, that's my seat, Mariam. And I'm like, well, it doesn't have your name on it. So there is this element of, it's a double responsibility, where we, like the older generation, we need to give more space for the youth. But the youth also, like I said about women, they should not be waiting to be given the space. They should be behaving as if they have the space, and move forward like that. Okay.
Oh.
Sorry, Jamille, take care of the other question on the other one, because it was from the audience of the Women's Advice.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So another question from the audience is, what is your assessment of the Women's Advisory Board that Stefan de Mistura formed in 2015, 2016, with 12 members from representing the political spectrum in Syria?
That's a key word.
Okay. What's your assessment?
So when we're talking about the UN, the advisory board is a UN creation. It's the Mistura who pushed for it and created it, because there is a lot of pressure and a lot of talk from the international community, from women organizations, that you need to include more women, at the table. So they came up with this brilliant idea where they're going to create an advisory board for the women. And at the beginning, actually, I need to be honest, and I was looking at it and I thinking, maybe this is actually maybe it's a good thing, women to advise on that the men cannot move ahead unless they get, the okay from the women. But the way it was done in the exact same way that the UN has been doing so many things, as much as I respect a lot of that institution, but it does a lot of things wrong. And one of them is that they view women as one thing. Women have no political opinions. Women are peacemakers only, and we can put every woman from every diverse political background or whatever they are on the same table and assume that they're going to come up with wonderful solutions by finding the common denominator. The common denominator among women, which is the same common denominator if you put me with a bunch of men at the table, is that we do need milk for children, we do need diapers for children, we do need medical aid, we do need a lot of these necessities on the ground. And this is what has happened to the advisory board. If you're going to come up with something that Syrian women agree on, and there was a disaster that happened, they came up in a press conference where they actually hit a point where they're asking for lifting the sanctions off the regime of Syria in order to let aid in, because it's the Syrian population that is suffering.
Right.
But you're feeding into a regime that's killing its own people. You're putting sanctions on this regime so that you curtail their movement a bit. So lifting up sanctions, you're actually hurting the population further, because you're giving them bigger weapons and bigger ways of how to kill and oppress people. There has to be ways of how to get aid into the people without having the regime take out the medical supplies and the necessity supplies that are going in. Because this is what has been happening, is that the aid is being sent by the UN inside Syria, and the regime takes it out. Like, you need to solve that problem before you can lift sanctions up. So this was one of the mistakes I think the advisory boards had done. One of the things is that, I mean, that's a mistake, but the whole idea of creating an advisory board, which we experienced, I was part of the advisory committee to the opposition, on the other hand, because they said, oh, wonderful idea, we don't need to include women at the table, we can just make them advisors. So we created the advisory committee also for the opposition, which I was part of, and I thought, okay, maybe we can do something. In hindsight, I need to say this, it actually further marginalized women. It became a systemic way of marginalizing women. Now we have an excuse of not including women because they're sitting at the advisory board, because they're sitting in the advisory committees. So actually the opposition has dissolved the advisory committee, and we are now, what we're doing in the Syrian Women Political Movement is including more women within the committees that already exist, which I think it's a better tactic. Mm-hmm. That's a very long answer to the advisory board question.
But it's an important point, so that as the UN and others kind of engage in future peace processes, to take the lesson of yes, are they recreating the same kind of challenges by forming new women's advisory groups in future peace processes?
Yeah. And the same thing, by the way, just because we're talking about it, the same thing with the civil society room. There is a civil society room that are sitting alone, like separately, advising the Mistura, and they're doing great work and they have great ideas, but where are those? How is that influencing the actual process? This is what we don't see, which is very important. You need to hear from civil society, you need to hear from women, but not in a closed off room where a paper that nobody reads or an opinion that nobody knows about.
So we have one question from Kamal Turkmani asking, what is your perspective on Idlib? So will the last opposition stronghold remain, and what do you think the U.S. government should do?
Idlib was not, as far as I'm concerned, Idlib was not saved from an imminent attack by the regime and its allies if it was not the international community coming together with Turkey to stop that attack. Because they're realizing the catastrophe that's going to come out of this. I mean, just think about Europe. Europe is so paranoid and it's like going up in arms like about all of the refugees that are coming. There are over 3 million people in Idlib, and they have nowhere else to go. In Ghouta they came to Idlib, in Hamas they came to Idlib, in Halab they came to Idlib, from Dar'a they came to Idlib. So they're coming from the rest of the country to Idlib. Now Idlib, it's the last stronghold. They're not going to go anywhere. And I think the international community wanted to, it knows how to use its will. Trump talked a lot about how he actually prevented an attack on Idlib because he's realized the massive catastrophe that can happen. We find that the Americans have gotten a lot more engaged, and they're holding strongly also in the northeast. And saying like about land, going back to the issue of land, the regime holds, a lot more land now, maybe up like to 60, 70% maybe. But there's still that chunk of land that they don't hold, which creates, which is mostly in Idlib and surrounding area, which makes it very, from the opposition hold, not the Kurdish and the American northeast. But that makes it a very sensitive area where it needs to stay to the engagement. The Russians are saying that this is a temporary thing. It's just for now. But I think it's a lot more serious than a temporary thing, because this is what's going to push the international community to find a real solution for Syria. They're not going to let that 3 million people. They're not gonna. The way we live in the world today, they cannot slaughter the people, because it's going to be a big catastrophe that's going to create a problem for the whole region. It's not because they're protecting Syrians, mind you. I'm sure like there are a lot of, it's self-interest that will not let them attack it, at least in the near or foreseeable future. Therefore, the push for creating a political solution, now the meeting that's going to happen on Saturday between Turkey, Russia, France, and Germany is actually about this.
So a question of how this can shift the discussion now because of the stakes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have another question from a postdoctoral researcher in Copenhagen wanting to know about the prospects for local solutions, local experiments. Can Syrians create cities where there's greater inclusion, where women's rights are protected more? Can they, within their own communities, create a space for greater inclusion that would set up, for those cities a smoother post-conflict transition and a transformation for those communities?
Yes. when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking Maslow. I need to survive. I need to be alive first before I can start mobilizing to a point where I'm creating a peaceful state, where they call them peace pockets. Like this is something that's been talked about, like creating peace pockets inside Syria that can spread. Like what is an area? What have they done? There are a few pockets in Syria that have actually been more or less secured. One of them had been attacked recently by Daesh under the watch of the regime and with the support of the regime, which is Sweda, and they abducted women from there, and it's a catastrophe where the international community has done nothing about it. So creating safe space, we thought, I mean, I don't know, looking from the outside, the people of Sweda have been very smart in how they dealt with a lot of issues with the government. They stayed outside, they did not participate in any of the conflict that has happened, and every time the regime tried to recruit the men of Sweda, there was a big resistance from them, saying we're not going to be part of this, and they wanted to keep their own pocket of safety, and so they had to pay the price for it by sending over Daesh, ISIS, and pillaging and killing and abducting women and children. So there is no safe space where you can go to that kind of level of awareness and participation. That doesn't mean that in general and in total that Syrian women are not getting more involved and that are not more active on a lot of different fronts, in spite of the militarization and in spite of all of the economic hardships that they're having. Women are still running households, they're running schools, they're running makeshift hospitals and nurses and doctors and teachers, and whether they get paid or not, they keep doing the work. And this in itself is a very powerful experience for the Syrian women to carry on when we're rebuilding the country, where they felt the fruits of their own work, their own hard work, where it has gotten them and where it can take them in the future.
So we have another question from Cecilia Pelasnasmi on accountability. So you've
Yes.
touched on this.
Yes.
She asked specifically what your suggestions are for crimes, including those committed by international actors, by other governments and others in Syria. But certainly there's a broader question around accountability of for those within Syria as well.
Yeah. When we talk accountability, we're very clear. We talk about accountability for all. Everyone who has had any violations of human rights in Syria needs to be held accountable. And that being said, we know that the regime, I mean, their governments, they're like people like the US has come in and like destroyed Raqqa completely, like hitting Daesh. It's the infrastructure of Raqqa, and a lot of the killings and the casualties of war that had happened there. It's not being talked about much, but it happened. It's there. And this happened not during just Trump time. This was Obama time also. So the all of the different nationals, all of the different governments that are on the ground in Syria is in no way compared to what the regime has done in Syria. The kind of torture, the kind of killing, the kind of impunity that it has behaved in Syria, and the kind of chaotic structure that it has created that has made it okay for people also to be killed. The mayhem, the chaotic nature of killing and looting that has been created in the country is all back to the regime giving space to its men to go and loot and rape and, behave in a way that they will never be held accountable. So when we're calling for accountability, we're calling for accountability at all fronts, at all levels, definitely. And one of the things that we support fully right now is that since the Security Council has been blocked completely by the Russians and the regime allies, we find that the General Assembly, from an international perspective, is that this is not going to happen locally, of course, in Syria. The Syrians, you cannot do anything there. So it has to be done from an international perspective, where now the independent international investigative mechanism has been created, the IIIM, which had its first meeting actually in the General Assembly of over 40 countries attending, over 28 civil society groups, human rights groups have signed a protocol in support of it. We're hoping that this actually will take effect, and we're calling for a special tribunal to be held for Syria, international special tribunal to be held for Syria, because regardless of what people say about, oh, this is going to not deter the regime, or the regime's going to be more scared and they're going to create more atrocities, they have to know that they can't keep on going with impunity. If somebody gets tried, if their names are coming out, if the accountability methods are being put forward, this will at least show some kind of restraint maybe from some of the actors that are on the ground. And we don't need to have been done with the crisis to actually start prosecuting and putting perpetrators on trial, because a lot of these people leave and come and travel around the world, and if you can capture them, catch them, all of these ones who are committing massive violations of human rights, it will start making somewhat of a difference on the ground to the people, people who are being killed and detained and tortured to no end.
We need to invest in any opportunities we have to respond to that.
Yes.
Our last question is from Chad Badwin, and he wants to know, how much do you cooperate with other organizations and networks that work on advancing opportunities for women and youth to engage in the peace process, in the political process in Syria?
One of the things we pride ourselves as Syrian Women Political Movement, I mean, we're a 1-year-old organization, but we have had, we come together because we are a lot of different organizations and a lot of different individuals and groups who have been working together on different programs on the ground, whether it's awareness programs, education programs, youth programs. People who have been doing a lot of all of this great, which I mentioned earlier, is that we felt that coming together and sharing the information and having the network within each other will actually make our move or our contribution to what's happening on the ground, and support to what's happening on the ground, and support to the Syrian in the diaspora also. There are 11 million people. Syrian population is 23 million people, and the official numbers are that 8 million people refugees. The unofficial numbers is 11 million refugees in the diaspora. Like, giving the support to the Syrian people so that they can have better programs, like better connection and better ways of how to bring peace and be more engaged in what's happening in everyone's from everyone's perspective. Because yes, we have an opposition representative opposition, we have started the Syrian Women Political Movement, but these are only few of the people that are talking about Syria. We need to get more of the voices. We need to be listening to what's happening on the ground on all different levels. That's the only way we're going to create programs that are going to be actually effective in creating change on the ground.
And just to reiterate a point you've shared before too, of looking at the lessons from women's political movements in other post-conflict and in other conflict situations, of seeing what you could draw from those models that you could that could inspire what Syrian women are looking to do as well.
Yes.
So I'm going to
And Maria's going to join us. Yes.
Scooch back in to wrap things out. I just wanted to bring up one comment, which I think pans back out to a really good universality point. That there's a group in New Haven who's watching. It's a group called PREST, People for Race and Ethnicity Studies Today, and there's 2 young women watching in a large group and saying they're facing exactly the same issues.
Wow.
Finding a seat and a voice.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you for reaching out and saying that, because I think that's a really wonderful way to wrap out, to remind that this is something you say a lot, is that this is something we're finding everywhere. There's very few entities who are doing a good job. So everybody can be working harder at that. So I hope that was all really interesting. Obviously, it's thank you all for sticking around and watching for so long. We weren't sure we were going to go for an hour, but we obviously could have gone longer, and it's clear why these 2 ladies make it really worth your while. And so again, this was hosted by PassBlue and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and co-sponsored by UN Women. And thank you again to Mariam Jalabi and Jamille Bigio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your contribution.